Today's story is titled, At My Sister's Wedding, Mom Mocked Me. 38. Still single until my 5B. Husband arrived by helicopter. The champagne glass trembled in my hand as my mother's voice sliced through the glittering ballroom. 200 guests turned toward me while she smiled into the microphone and called me the greatest disappointment in our family. My sister sat beside her new husband, glowing in her designer gown, while relatives laughed as though my humiliation were part of the evening's entertainment. They thought I had arrived alone because no man had ever chosen me. They believed the quiet daughter sitting near the kitchen doors had nothing, no husband, no family, and no power. I let them laugh. Then I rose from my chair, looked directly at my mother, and said, "You keep asking about my husband. The funny thing is, you have already met him." Her smile faltered, but only for a second. She accused me of lying, desperate to protect the perfect image she had spent years building. That was when the crystal glasses began to shake. A thunderous sound rolled across the night sky, growing louder until every guest rushed toward the windows. A black helicopter descended onto the hotel's private landing pad. The doors opened, and the man my family once treated like a servant stepped onto the red carpet. He was now worth $5 billion, and he had come for his wife. Stay until the end, because his arrival was only the first revelation. Before that wedding night was over, hidden betrayals, stolen money, and a family secret buried for generations would finally be exposed, delivering the revenge and satisfaction they never saw coming. My name is Emily Hargrove. I was 38 years old and worked as a freelance financial consultant from a modest home in the Dallas suburbs, a quiet career that suited the life I had built away from my family's judgment. To most people who knew the Hargroves, I was the older daughter who had never fulfilled her potential, the one who lived plainly, stayed out of photographs, and gave everyone else something to feel superior about. Long before the wedding night, when everything changed, I had learned how easily a family could decide who mattered and who did not. In our house, Sarah mattered. I did not. My mother, Margaret, never said those exact words when we were children, but she found 1,000 ways to make the message clear. Sarah received praise for entering a room. I received instructions on how not to embarrass anyone once I was there. Sarah was graceful, charming, and naturally social. I was serious, observant, and more comfortable with books and numbers than with country club conversations. My mother treated those differences as evidence that something was wrong with me. She had spent years building her identity around Dallas society. She had served as president of an exclusive country club, chaired charity luncheons, and mastered the art of smiling while quietly measuring everyone's worth. To her, a woman's life was not judged by kindness, courage, or independence. It was judged by the man standing beside her and the family name printed on his business card. She repeated that lesson so often that it became part of the background noise of my childhood. "A woman must marry well, Emily," she would say, while fastening pearls around her neck. "Talent is useful, but position is what protects you." Sarah absorbed those words like sunlight. I learned to survive them like bad weather. By the time we were adults, every family gathering followed the same pattern. Sarah would arrive wearing something new, carrying a story about a fashionable restaurant, a charity event, or a promising man. The room would brighten around her. Then someone would remember I was there and ask whether I had met anyone special yet. The question was never sincere. It was an invitation for the rest of the family to compare our lives. I became skilled at smiling without answering. Silence was easier than explaining myself to people who had already decided the truth. What they called failure was often simply privacy. What they called loneliness was a life they had never been invited to see. I had a profession I was proud of. I advised small businesses and private clients, untangling financial problems that frightened people who were used to hiding behind expensive lawyers. I understood debt, risk, contracts, and the dangerous stories families told themselves about money. My mother dismissed my work because I did it from home and did not brag about my clients. She imagined me sitting alone at a kitchen table, struggling to pay bills. I allowed her to imagine it. There was a strange kind of freedom in being underestimated. Still, knowing their opinions were false did not make them painless. My family had been shaping that wound since I was a teenager. During my senior year of high school, I had worked towards scholarships with the desperate focus of someone who believed education might offer an escape. My grades were nearly perfect. My teachers encouraged me to apply to several prestigious universities. I spent weeks writing essays, collecting recommendations, and checking every application twice. Then, just before the deadlines, the files vanished from our family computer. The printed copies disappeared from my room. By the time I realized what had happened, it was too late to recreate everything. Sarah had been the last person near my desk. She claimed she had only been helping me clean. My mother did not question her. Instead, she accused me of carelessness and said perhaps I had never been ready for such schools. I never proved what Sarah had done, but I remembered the look on her face when I asked her about it. It was not innocence, it was fear mixed with satisfaction. That moment taught me something important. In our family, the truth did not matter as much as the role each person had been assigned. Sarah was the promising daughter. I was the disappointment. Any fact that threatened those roles would be ignored, reshaped, or buried. Years later, when Sarah announced her engagement to Mark Preston, my mother treated the news like the fulfillment of a prophecy. Mark came from a respected banking family, and his last name opened doors at clubs where Margaret still cared deeply about being welcomed. Every phone call became a celebration of Sarah's good judgment and a reminder of my supposed failure. "It is not too late for you," my mother told me one morning, using the soft voice she reserved for cruel observations. "There are widowers who value companionship. You may have to be realistic, of course." I looked around my kitchen while she spoke. The morning light lay across the table, touching a closed leather diary and a framed photograph turned slightly away from the window. She believed she was describing my life, but she knew almost nothing about it. "I will keep that in mind," I said. Agreeing with her had become easier than defending a truth I was not ready to reveal. A week before the wedding, Sarah sent me photographs from her final dress fitting. She looked beautiful, and I told her so. Her reply came seconds later. She suggested I wear the old blue prom dress hanging in the back of my closet because it was vintage and suited my thrift store lifestyle. I read the message twice, then placed my phone face down. The insult was familiar, but something inside me had changed. I no longer felt the old urge to convince them I was worthy. I only felt tired of helping them maintain the illusion that they knew me. When the wedding invitation arrived, my mother had attached a handwritten note to the back. "Come if you want, but do not embarrass the family." I stood at the kitchen counter holding that expensive paper between my fingers, remembering every dinner where I had been ignored, every accomplishment that had been minimized, and every time Sarah had smiled while I was reduced to a warning about how not to live. Then I walked to my bedroom and unlocked the small wooden box hidden inside my dresser. The documents inside had been protected for years. As I lifted the first one into the light, I understood that my family's story about me had survived only because I had allowed it to. That permission was about to end. The first document in the box was our marriage certificate, its edges softened from the number of times I had unfolded it in private. Beneath it lay Rose's birth certificate and a handful of photographs that captured the life my family had never been allowed to see. Looking at them, I was taken back 6 years to a church barbecue in North Dallas, where I first met Richard Alcott. He was standing behind a long folding table, turning vegetables over an open grill, while volunteers carried trays to families gathered beneath white tents. At the time, I assumed he was simply another church member helping with dinner. He wore rolled sleeves, an old apron, and the relaxed expression of a man who did not need to prove he belonged. I had arrived after another exhausting conversation with my mother and chosen a table near the edge of the lawn, hoping no one would notice me. Richard noticed anyway. He brought me a plate of grilled tomatoes, peppers, and corn arranged with more care than the occasion required. "You look like someone who forgot to eat," he said. There was no judgment in his voice, only concern. That small kindness unsettled me, because I had grown used to people studying me for weaknesses rather than needs. We talked until the folding chairs were being stacked. He told me he had started as a line cook, worked his way through hotel kitchens, and recently opened his third restaurant. He spoke about food as if it were a promise between strangers, a way of telling someone they mattered without needing a speech. I told him I worked in finance and preferred helping small businesses survive to advising wealthy clients on how to become wealthier. He smiled and said that sounded more useful than most jobs he knew. Richard never seemed impressed by the Hargrove name. In fact, when I mentioned my family, his expression tightened for a moment, before he changed the subject. I did not understand why, until much later. What drew him to me was not my background, but the way I treated the volunteers, clearing plates, and the elderly women waiting for rides home. What drew me to him was the complete absence of performance. He was ambitious, but not vain, confident, but never cruel. Over the months that followed, we met for coffee, walked through neighborhood markets, and spent quiet evenings discussing the kinds of lives we wanted rather than the ones other people expected us to build. Richard's business expanded quickly, but he remained the man who cooked when he was worried and listened without interrupting. I resisted trusting him longer than I should have. My caution had been earned. In my 20s, my mother had destroyed 2 relationships before either man had the courage to understand what she was doing. She called one family and described me as unstable. She used club connections to pressure another man's employer until he accepted a transfer out of Dallas. By the time I met Richard, happiness felt less like a gift than something that could be stolen the moment Margaret discovered it. When he proposed, I did not answer immediately. We were sitting in his apartment kitchen after midnight, sharing pie from the same plate because neither of us had remembered to buy groceries. He did not kneel or produce a photographer. He simply took my hand and said he wanted every ordinary morning with me. I cried, then told him everything I had been too ashamed to admit, including how afraid I was that my mother would find a way to ruin him. Richard listened carefully. Then he said, "We do not have to give her access to what is ours. We married at the Dallas County Courthouse 5 years ago with 2 witnesses and a bouquet of white daisies from a street vendor. I wore a cream dress I already owned. Richard wore the suit he used for investor meetings. There were no photographers, no ballroom, and no announcement in the society pages. It was the first important day of my life that belonged entirely to me." A few months later, I discovered I was pregnant. I had not planned to tell my mother immediately, but family secrets rarely stayed hidden in Dallas. Margaret learned through a medical office employee who knew someone at the club. She arrived at my house without calling and sat across from me as if she were negotiating a scandal. Her concern was not my health or the baby's future. She wanted to know when Richard and I intended to stage a respectable wedding and whether anyone else knew. When I refused to let her control the situation, she demanded that I end the pregnancy quietly. She said a child appearing without a public marriage would humiliate the family and damage Sarah's chances of making a prestigious match. I remember placing both hands over my stomach, even though there was nothing visible yet. For once, I did not shrink beneath her disappointment. I told her no. She said that if I chose the baby, I was choosing life, without the Hargroves. Richard came home before she left. He did not raise his voice or threaten her. He stood beside me and told Margaret that our child would grow up, surrounded by love, whether she chose to be part of that life or not. She walked out without looking back. Rose was born the following spring, healthy, loud, and furious at the world for making her wait. The first time Richard placed her in my arms, I understood that the family I had feared losing had never truly protected me. This one would. For the next 4 years, we built a private life filled with bedtime stories, business trips, Sunday breakfasts, and the kind of peace I had once believed existed only in other people's homes. Richard's company grew from restaurants into Alcott Hospitality, then into hotel investments and financial holdings. I continued working under my own name because independence mattered to me. We kept our marriage quiet not from shame, but because secrecy gave us room to grow without Margaret's interference. On the morning before Sarah's wedding, Richard called from New York while Rose sat on my lap. I told him I was ready to stop hiding. He promised to arrive that evening, but I insisted I could face the ceremony alone until he finished his meetings. Hours later, after another message from Sarah mocking my clothes and another warning from Margaret not to attract attention, I changed my mind. I sent Richard 4 words. "Bring Rose with you." His answer came almost immediately. "We are already coming." What I did not know was that before boarding the helicopter, Richard had received a confidential audit report bearing the name of Sarah's new husband. The name on that audit report belonged to a man who was about to welcome me into his family by treating me as though I did not belong there at all. I arrived at the Alcott Grand just after 4 in the afternoon, driving my aging Honda through a line of polished black cars waiting beneath the hotel's glass canopy. The building rose over downtown Dallas in silver and stone, elegant without trying too hard, the kind of place Margaret considered proof that a family had finally arrived. I handed my keys to the valet and walked into the lobby carrying a small overnight bag, aware that my plain navy dress and sensible shoes drew little attention among the silk gowns and tailored suits. At the reception desk, a young woman searched my name twice before her expression shifted. "Miss Hargrove," she said carefully, "your accommodation was arranged by the wedding party." She gave me a key card and added that the room did not include access to the executive lounge or family hospitality suite. I thanked her and took the elevator to the 3rd floor. My room was narrow, clean, and positioned above the loading dock, where delivery trucks hissed and reversed beneath my window. The rest of the wedding party occupied the upper floors overlooking the city. Margaret had not forgotten me. She had placed me exactly where she believed I belonged. I had barely set down my bag when my phone rang. "Where are you?" my mother demanded. "The photographer is preparing family portraits, and we cannot keep everyone waiting because you move at your own pace." I told her I was on my way. When I reached the lobby, Margaret stood beneath a crystal chandelier in a champagne silk dress, directing relatives with the confidence of a military commander. Her eyes traveled over me from head to toe. "That cannot be what you are wearing tonight." "It is appropriate," I said. "Appropriate is what people say when they cannot afford elegant." Her voice was low, but not low enough to prevent 2 nearby women from hearing. She stepped closer and adjusted my sleeve as if correcting a servant. "You will stand at the edge of the photographs. Sarah deserves to remember this day without distractions." Across the lobby, Sarah stood surrounded by bridesmaids in coordinated pastel gowns. She looked radiant, and for a moment I felt a familiar softness toward her. Whatever existed between us, she was still my sister, and this was a day she had dreamed about for years. Then she noticed me and laughed. "You did not actually bring the prom dress, did you?" One of the bridesmaids covered a smile with her hand. "I brought something suitable," I replied. "Good," Sarah said. "I was worried people might think the hotel was hosting a reunion theme." The women around her laughed politely. Sarah turned away before I could answer, already calling for the photographer to capture another picture of her train. I returned to my room before the ceremony and opened my suitcase. The old blue dress lay folded on top, exactly where Sarah expected it to be. Beneath it, wrapped in tissue paper, was the red Chanel gown Richard had commissioned for our 5th anniversary. I lifted it into the light and watched the fabric change from crimson to deep ruby as it moved. It was not valuable because of the label. It was valuable because Richard had chosen it after listening to me say, years earlier, that red was the color I wore before my mother taught me to disappear. I changed slowly, pinned my hair back, and looked at myself in the mirror. The woman staring back did not resemble the apologetic daughter Margaret expected. Still, I placed a light coat over the gown before going downstairs. I wanted to see how far they would go, while they still believed I had nothing. The ballroom had been transformed into a white and gold display of roses, candles, and polished glass. A calligraphed seating chart stood near the entrance. I found Margaret's table first, then the Prestons, the bridesmaids, and the country club guests. My name appeared on the final page beside table 12. A server guided me toward a small table near the kitchen doors, where the noise of stacked plates and rushing staff leaked through every time someone passed. "Is this correct?" she asked with visible discomfort. "The family made the assignments," I said. Her eyes softened. "I am sorry." That apology from a stranger hurt more than the arrangement itself. It meant the insult was so obvious that even someone outside the family could see it. During cocktail hour, I approached Sarah to congratulate her. She accepted my embrace without warmth, then turned toward a group of photographers before I could ask about the seating plan. Mark stepped into my path with a drink in his hand. He was handsome in the polished, practiced way that had impressed Margaret from the beginning. "Table 12 is not so bad," he said. "You are close to the food." I stared at him. He grinned. "Come on, Emily. It is free dinner and champagne. Not everyone needs to sit with the real family." He walked away laughing, and several men beside him joined in. I returned to my chair and removed my coat. Heads turned as the red gown caught the chandelier light, but Margaret's expression showed only irritation. Dinner passed with speeches, music, and applause from tables too far away to notice me. Then Margaret rose and took the microphone. She praised Sarah's beauty, Mark's family, and the importance of making wise choices. Her gaze found me at the back of the room. "Some women understand how to build a meaningful life," she said. "Others reach a certain point and discover they have no one beside them." A ripple of laughter moved through the ballroom. Sarah smiled. Mark leaned toward his friends. I felt 200 pairs of eyes settle on me, waiting for me to shrink. Instead, I placed my glass on the table and looked toward the windows. The first faint vibration passed through the floor, just as my phone lit up with a message from Richard. "We have landed." The message appeared just as the vibration beneath my feet grew stronger. At first, the guests assumed it was part of the hotel's sound system, some dramatic flourish arranged for Sarah's reception. Then the chandeliers trembled, the glasses on the tables began to quiver, and a low mechanical thunder rolled across the night outside. Conversations stopped one by one. Chairs scraped against the floor as people turned toward the wall of windows overlooking the private landing area. Margaret still held the microphone, but even she could not compete with the roar of the helicopter descending beyond the ballroom. "How theatrical," she said, forcing a laugh. "Some people will do anything for attention." A few guests laughed with her, but the sound was uncertain now. I rose from my seat and walked toward the windows. Through the glass, I saw the black helicopter settle onto the illuminated pad, its blades cutting the air into violent circles. The side door opened, and Richard stepped down in a dark suit, one hand steadying Rose as he lifted her into his arms. Her white dress fluttered in the wind, and even from inside the ballroom I could see her excitement. For one brief moment, the years of secrecy fell away. They were not symbols of wealth or victory to me. They were simply my husband and my daughter coming to stand beside me. Sarah moved closer to the glass, narrowing her eyes. "I know him," she said. "That is the man from the church barbecue. The one who served the food." Mark laughed loudly enough for everyone around him to hear. "So this is the husband? Emily hired the church cook and rented a helicopter?" He lifted his champagne glass in my direction. "I have to admit, that is commitment." Several of his friends joined in, relieved to have an explanation that allowed them to continue looking down on me. Margaret lowered the microphone and approached. "End this now," she whispered. "You have embarrassed yourself enough." I met her gaze. "Not yet." The ballroom doors opened, and Rose's voice carried through the lobby before she even saw me. "Mama." Every face turned. She wriggled out of Richard's arms and ran toward me, her shoes tapping quickly across the marble floor. I knelt and caught her against my chest. The room went completely still. Whatever story they had invented about hired actors became harder to maintain when a child wrapped her arms around my neck with the unquestioning affection of someone who had done it every day of her life. Richard reached us a moment later and placed one hand gently at my back. "I am sorry we are late," he said. His calmness unsettled Mark more than anger would have. Sarah stared at us, then at Rose, then back at Richard. "You cannot be serious," she said. "Emily, who is this really?" Before I could answer, the hotel's general manager hurried across the lobby with 2 senior staff members behind him. I knew him by sight, though we had never met formally. He stopped in front of Richard and extended his hand with visible concern. "Mr. Alcott, we were not informed you would be attending tonight. Please accept my apologies. Your family should have been placed in the owner's suite." The words landed with more force than the helicopter. Mark's smile disappeared. Margaret's expression tightened, as if she had misheard. The manager turned toward me. "Mrs. Alcott, I am deeply sorry for the accommodation and seating arrangement. We were told the requests came directly from the bride's family." A murmur swept through the room. Someone near the front whispered Richard's full name. Another guest pulled out a phone. Within seconds, recognition began spreading across the crowd. Alcott Hospitality, Alcott Grand, restaurants, resorts, investment properties. The man they had dismissed as a church cook was the founder of the company whose hotel they were standing in. Richard never looked away from me. "Were you treated properly?" he asked. I glanced toward the receptionist, the servers, and the manager. They looked frightened, but they had not created the cruelty. They had followed instructions. "The staff did what they were told," I said. "Find out who gave those instructions. No one loses a job for obeying a wedding arrangement they did not design." The manager nodded with relief and stepped back. Mark pushed forward, his face flushed. "This proves nothing. Owning a hotel does not give you the right to storm into my wedding and threaten people." Richard turned toward him. "I have not threatened anyone." His voice remained level. "But I do need to speak with you about First National." Mark went still. Richard continued. "Alcott Holdings acquired a controlling interest in the bank 6 months ago. An independent review has identified irregular transfers connected to accounts under your supervision." "That is ridiculous," Mark snapped. "You cannot fire me because your wife is offended." "You are not being fired tonight," Richard said. "You are being suspended pending investigation. The board has already been notified, and the records have been preserved." The distinction mattered. This was not revenge disguised as authority, it was consequence supported by evidence. Mark looked around for help, but the men who had laughed with him began stepping away. Margaret reached for my arm. "Emily, stop this. You have made your point." I pulled free. "No, Mother. You made your point when you placed me beside the kitchen and turned my life into a joke." I walked back toward the ballroom, picked up the microphone she had abandoned, and faced the guests who had laughed only minutes earlier. Richard stood behind me with Rose in his arms, but the truth I was about to tell belonged to me. "You all want to know why my family never knew about my husband or my daughter," I said. "The answer begins 5 years ago, when my mother asked me to choose between being a Hargrove and keeping the child I was carrying." The words left my mouth and seemed to change the temperature in the room. No one moved. I could hear the faint hum of the hotel ventilation, the clink of a spoon being set down somewhere near the back, and Rose shifting quietly in Richard's arms. I looked at my mother and saw, for the first time that evening, not outrage or embarrassment, but fear. She knew exactly what I was about to say. 5 years earlier, I had stood in the small kitchen of my old apartment with a positive pregnancy test in my hand, and more hope than I had ever dared to feel. Richard and I were already legally married, but our marriage was private, protected from the reach of a family that had destroyed too many good things in my life. I had planned to tell Margaret when I felt ready, after the first doctor's appointment, after I knew the baby was healthy, after I had found the courage to face whatever judgment she would deliver. I never got the chance. Someone from the medical office knew one of her friends, and in Dallas, gossip traveled faster than truth. Margaret arrived at my apartment without calling. She did not ask how far along I was. She did not ask whether I was frightened or happy. She sat at my kitchen table, placed her handbag beside her chair, and asked who else knew. I remember the way she said it, as if my child were not a life but a leak that needed to be contained. I told her Richard knew. She asked whether we had arranged a proper wedding. When I explained that we were already married, she stared at me in disbelief, then anger. To her, a marriage that had not been announced in the society pages did not count. It did not improve the Hargrove name, impress the club, or provide her with photographs she could display. "You have made one selfish decision after another," she said. "Now you expect the rest of us to live with the consequences." I placed a hand over my stomach. "This is not a consequence. This is my child." Her expression hardened. She told me that no one would believe I had been married before becoming pregnant. She said people would assume I had trapped a man or invented the marriage afterward to save face. More than anything, she worried that the scandal would affect Sarah. At the time, Sarah was beginning to move through the social circles Margaret valued, and our mother believed one daughter's private choices could ruin the other daughter's prospects. "Do not drag your sister down with you," she said. Then she gave me the choice she had already decided was reasonable. End the pregnancy quietly, let the family announce my marriage later in a manner she could control, and return to the role she had chosen for me. Or keep the baby and lose the Hargroves completely. Even now, speaking into the microphone, I could feel the cold surface of that kitchen table beneath my fingers. I remembered how frightened I had been, not because I doubted my love for the child, but because some part of me still wanted my mother to choose me. I wanted her to look at my face and see her daughter, not a threat to her reputation. She never did. I told her I would keep my baby. She stood so quickly that the chair struck the wall. "Then do not come asking for help," she said. "You are making your decision." Richard arrived before she left. He took one look at my face and understood something terrible had happened. Margaret turned on him with the same cold contempt she reserved for anyone she considered beneath her. She called him an opportunist and accused him of using me to gain access to our family. Richard did not argue about his money, his business, or his future. He simply came to my side and said, "Our child will be loved. You may be part of that, or you may walk away." Margaret chose to walk away. That night, I packed the few belongings I still kept at the Hargrove house. Rain hammered the windshield as Richard drove, and I sat beside him with both hands pressed against my stomach, wondering how a woman could feel so devastated and so certain at the same time. I was losing the last illusion that my mother's love might someday become unconditional, but I was choosing a child who would never have to earn mine. Rose was born the following spring. She entered the world, screaming, furious and perfect. When the nurse placed her against my chest, I understood that no country club, family name, or inheritance could equal the weight of that tiny body trusting me completely. I looked across the ballroom at Margaret. "The little girl standing here tonight is the child you asked me to erase," I said. A sound moved through the crowd, not quite a gasp, more like 200 people realizing at once that the evening had crossed into something they could no longer dismiss as family gossip. Rose looked up at me from Richard's arms. "Why did Grandma not want me?" she asked softly. The question broke something open inside the room. I walked to her and touched her cheek. "There was never anything wrong with you," I said. Some adults become so afraid of what other people think that they forget what love is supposed to protect. Margaret's mouth trembled. I was trying to protect this family. I reached into my bag and removed the marriage certificate, the old messages she had sent, and the records I had carried for years. I placed them on the nearest table. "No," I said. "You were protecting an image." Then I opened the thicker folder beneath them and watched the color drain from her face. "And if you want to talk about protecting the Hargrove family, Mother, then we should finally discuss what you have really been hiding." The folder contained the truth my mother had spent years protecting with silence, social influence, and carefully arranged lies. I opened it slowly, not because I was uncertain, but because I wanted Margaret to understand that every page had been verified before I brought it into that ballroom. The first document was not about some distant crime or forgotten ancestor. It concerned the Hargrove house, the red brick home where Sarah and I had grown up beneath portraits of relatives who were spoken of as if they had built Dallas with their own hands. 3 years earlier, that house had nearly been lost. Margaret had invested heavily in a private development project, promoted by one of her country club friends. The project collapsed, leaving her with debts large enough to trigger foreclosure. No one in the family knew the full extent of the damage, because Margaret had hidden the notices and continued hosting luncheons as though nothing had changed. "You told everyone Sarah saved the house," I said, looking toward my sister. "You told your friends she introduced you to a private investor who paid off the loan." Sarah's face tightened. She did not deny it. I removed a transfer record and placed it beside the marriage certificate. "That investor was a trust I created." The money came from my consulting income and investments. I bought the debt through an attorney so the bank would not take the house. Margaret stared at the document. That is impossible. You signed the revised payment agreement, I replied. You simply never asked who controlled the trust. I had not done it to win her approval. At the time, my father was still alive, and despite everything, I could not bear the thought of him losing the only home he had known for 40 years. I also knew Margaret would rather let the property disappear than admit she needed help from the daughter she had labeled a failure. So I protected the house without revealing myself. Sarah knew more than our mother realized. She had been present when the attorney delivered the final paperwork. She understood that the rescue had not come from her, yet she allowed Margaret to praise her at dinners and club meetings. I did not ask her to lie for me, Sarah said quickly. No, I answered. You only accepted the credit. She looked down at the scattered white roses near her shoes. The silence around us had changed. Earlier, the guests had been hungry for spectacle. Now they were listening with the discomfort of people who recognized pieces of their own families in ours. I turned to Sarah. There is something else you need to tell the truth about. Her eyes lifted, and I saw immediately that she knew what I meant. My scholarship applications, I said. The files did not vanish by accident. Margaret shook her head. That was years ago. Emily was careless. I was not careless. I took out copies of emails recovered from an old family computer, along with a statement from the technician who had restored the deleted files. The records showed that the applications had been opened from Sarah's account and removed 2 days before the deadline. Sarah's breathing grew shallow. I was 16, she whispered. You were old enough to know what you were doing. Tears gathered in her eyes, but I did not soften the truth. She admitted she had been terrified that I would leave Dallas, attend a prestigious university, and become the daughter Margaret admired. She believed there was only enough approval for one of us, and she had been trained to fight for it. I thought if you succeeded, she said, I would disappear. So you made sure I lost the chance. She nodded once. Her confession did not heal anything, but it finally placed responsibility where it belonged. I then mentioned the church barbecue where she had flirted with Richard. Sarah looked embarrassed rather than defiant. She had not known he was my husband. She had only recognized that he was interested in someone else and wanted to prove she could draw his attention away. That habit, the need to win every comparison, had shaped more of our relationship than either of us wanted to admit. Richard had refused her politely, and I had chosen not to expose her then. The final section of the folder reached further back than our personal grievances. After my father's death, I had reviewed old property records connected to the family estate. Several parcels acquired by my grandfather during the 1960s had been purchased through companies that pressured elderly landowners into selling far below market value. In 2 cases, signatures on transfer documents had been challenged, but quietly settled through lawyers connected to the Hargrove family. It was not a secret fortune built entirely on crime, but it was enough to stain the story Margaret told about honorable wealth passed cleanly from one generation to the next. You knew there were questions, I said to her. You found the correspondence after grandfather died. Margaret's expression hardened. Those matters were resolved. They were buried. I explained that I had hired independent attorneys and researchers to identify the surviving families affected by the disputed deals. Where the claims could be supported, I arranged compensation through the trust and separated questionable assets from the legitimate estate. I had spent nearly 2 years correcting harm created long before I was born. Margaret had fought every attempt to review the records because she feared public embarrassment more than unresolved injustice. You called me disloyal, I reminded her. But loyalty does not mean preserving a lie. Sarah stared at the documents as if they belonged to strangers. The perfect family legacy she had spent her life trying to represent was cracking in front of her. Still, shame quickly turned into anger. Why tonight? She demanded. Why did you have to do this here? Because tonight you all used that family name as a weapon against me again. She flinched, but she was not ready to accept everything. She accused me of choosing the most public moment possible because I wanted revenge. Perhaps part of me did want them to feel the humiliation they had handed me so casually, but I had not created the debts, deleted the applications, hidden the land records, or lied about who saved the house. I had only stopped carrying those secrets for them. By morning, Margaret had found a way to strike back. I woke in the hotel suite to my phone vibrating across the nightstand. On the screen was a local news report displaying my photograph beneath a headline that read, "Jealous Sister Stages Billionaire Spectacle to Destroy Dallas Wedding." The headline was only the beginning. By 7 that morning, clips from the wedding had spread across local television, gossip sites, and social media, edited so carefully that I appeared to be the aggressor, while Margaret and Sarah looked like victims of an elaborate public attack. One video showed me taking the microphone but cut away before I explained why. Another showed Richard entering the ballroom with Rose, but removed the hotel manager's confirmation of who he was. The story being sold to Dallas was simple. A bitter older sister had staged a billionaire spectacle to destroy the bride's special day. Margaret gave a statement before breakfast. She described me as emotionally unstable, obsessed with Sarah, and prone to creating fantasies whenever I felt ignored. She claimed the documents I revealed had been misunderstood, and that I had manipulated Richard into using his wealth against the family. Sarah posted a tearful video from the bridal suite, her makeup gone, and her voice shaking. She said she had spent years trying to love me despite my jealousy, only to have me ruin the happiest night of her life. Mark stood beside her and promised legal action against Richard for abuse of corporate power, wrongful suspension, and defamation. For 1 dangerous hour, anger consumed me. I wanted to answer every accusation immediately. I wanted to post the marriage certificate, the messages from Margaret, the bank records, and every document in the folder. Richard stopped me before I could begin. He sat across from me at the breakfast table, while Rose colored quietly beside us and said, "If we fight them with emotion, they will turn the noise into the story. We answer with facts that cannot be argued away." He had already instructed the bank to preserve every relevant account, email, and transfer connected to Mark. He also hired an outside auditing firm with no ties to Alcott Holdings, so no one could claim the investigation was created for revenge. The board placed Mark on formal administrative leave and notified federal regulators that suspicious activity had been identified. Richard did not release the details publicly. He understood that evidence weakened when it looked like a weapon. I began building my own record. I organized the marriage documents by date, printed photographs showing our life over several years, and requested certified copies of Rose's birth records. I gathered the messages Margaret had sent when she learned of my pregnancy, including the one that read, "If you choose this child, do not expect to return to this family." I also pulled the trust documents proving I had purchased the debt on the Hargrove house, along with correspondence from the attorneys handling the old land claims. For the first time, I was not preparing to defend my feelings. I was preparing to establish a timeline. By noon, the story shifted again. A former employee from Mark's bank contacted Richard's legal team. She had worked in compliance and had raised concerns months earlier about transfers from employee retirement accounts into consulting companies with no visible staff or operations. Her concerns had been dismissed, and she had later been pressured to resign. She still possessed copies of internal memos and transaction summaries. Those records showed that money had moved through several accounts under Mark's supervision, then into companies controlled by 2 of his friends. One transfer carried Sarah's name as an authorized signatory. When I saw it, I felt no satisfaction. I knew exactly what it meant. Mark had used his marriage to make the transactions look respectable, and Sarah might be left holding responsibility for money she had never understood. That afternoon, Sarah called me. Her voice was no longer wounded for the camera. It was frightened. She asked whether I knew about the accounts in her name. I told her I knew enough to understand she needed an independent attorney, not one chosen by Mark or Margaret. "Are you trying to scare me?" she asked. "No," I said. "I am trying to keep you from being sacrificed." She was silent for several seconds. Then she whispered that Mark had asked her to sign papers during the engagement, telling her they were routine documents for tax planning. Margaret had encouraged her to sign because the Preston name was finally giving the family access to the kind of financial influence she had always wanted. When Sarah confronted Mark, he accused her of disloyalty and told her that if she cooperated with investigators, he would say she had designed the transfers herself. She called Margaret next. Our mother told her to stand beside her husband and continue blaming me. She said the family could survive one unstable daughter, but not a public scandal involving the bride. Hearing that broke something in Sarah. For the first time, she understood that Margaret's loyalty was not to either of us. It was to appearances. Richard's attorneys advised me to make one public statement. We held a brief press conference in a hotel meeting room with no dramatic entrance, no music, and no family confrontation. I spoke for less than 10 minutes. I gave the dates of my marriage, Rose's birth, the house trust, and the messages from Margaret. Richard's attorney confirmed that the bank investigation had begun before the wedding and was being handled independently. We released copies of documents that could be verified by courts, banks, and public records. I did not call Margaret cruel. I did not call Sarah a liar. I simply placed the facts in order and allowed the truth to speak without performance. By evening, the coverage changed. Reporters began questioning why Margaret had described a legally documented marriage as a fantasy. Financial journalists focused on Mark's suspended accounts and the compliance complaint. The same commentators who had mocked me that morning now called the situation a possible fraud scandal. Mark's lawsuit threat disappeared from his attorney's statement. Near midnight, someone knocked on our front door. When I opened it, Sarah stood on the porch, wearing the same wedding gown she had never changed out of, mascara dark beneath her eyes and a thick envelope clutched against her chest. Mark used my name to hide the money, she said. Then she looked past me toward the house where Rose was sleeping and added, and Mother knew more than she admitted. Sarah stepped inside before I answered, moving like someone who had forgotten how to trust the floor beneath her. Richard joined us in the living room, and she placed the thick envelope on the coffee table with both hands. Inside were copies of wire instructions, shell company registrations, and account summaries Mark had kept in a locked drawer at their home. Several documents carried Sarah's signature, but the dates showed they had been presented to her during the engagement, mixed among insurance forms, prenuptial revisions, and routine banking paperwork. Mark had counted on her not reading closely. He had also counted on Margaret's hunger for prestige to keep her from asking questions. Mother told me the Preston family had people who handled these things, Sarah said. She said signing quickly would show I trusted my future husband. Her voice broke on the last word. I read the documents while Richard contacted the independent attorneys already working with the bank. The records connected Mark directly to the consulting companies identified by the former compliance employee. They also contained messages showing that he had discussed using Sarah as a legal shield if regulators ever questioned the transfers. Margaret's name appeared in a smaller group of emails. She had not designed the scheme, but she had been warned that Mark's financial arrangements were unusually secretive. Instead of investigating, she had urged Sarah not to risk losing the marriage over technical matters. Sarah sank onto the sofa and covered her face. I spent my whole life trying to become the daughter she could display, she said. Now I find out she was willing to let me take the blame. I wanted to comfort her, but sympathy could not replace honesty. I told her that Mark's betrayal did not erase the choices she had made toward me. She had deleted my applications, accepted praise for saving the house, laughed while I was humiliated, and helped spread lies after the wedding. Sarah lowered her hands and nodded. For once, she did not blame Margaret, childhood pressure, or fear. I did those things, she said. Mom taught me to compete with you, but I chose to keep doing it long after I knew it was wrong. That admission mattered more than tears. She then told me about one act I had never connected to her. 5 years earlier, after I left the Hargrove house, an envelope had appeared beneath the door of my apartment. It contained cash, our grandmother's silver bracelet, and a note with no signature that read, "For whatever comes next." I had assumed my father sent it secretly. Sarah confessed that she had taken the money from her savings and delivered it before dawn. "I was too afraid to stand beside you," she said, "so I did the smallest thing I could without Mother knowing." The gesture did not undo the years of harm, and she did not ask me to pretend it did. But it proved that even then, beneath the jealousy and fear, some part of her understood I had been wronged. By morning, the envelope was in the hands of federal investigators. Mark was taken into custody 2 days later, on charges connected to wire fraud, pension theft, and falsified financial records. His attorneys attempted to suggest that Sarah had participated willingly, but the messages in his own files showed he had deliberately kept her uninformed while using her name. She still faced questions and public scrutiny, but she cooperated fully and surrendered access to every account he had opened. Their marriage ended before the wedding flowers had wilted. Sarah moved into a small apartment and began dealing with the practical consequences of a life built around appearances. Margaret's fall was quieter, but, for her, more devastating. The country club asked her to resign from every honorary position. Invitations stopped arriving. Women who had praised her judgment for decades avoided her calls. When Sarah left the family home, Margaret found herself alone inside the house I had once saved, surrounded by furniture chosen to impress people who no longer visited. A week later, she suffered a severe panic attack and was taken to the hospital. I went because I needed to see her without the ballroom, the cameras, or the protection of her social role. She looked smaller in the hospital bed, but I reminded myself that vulnerability was not the same as innocence. Margaret admitted that she had always resented the part of me she could not control. I questioned the rules she had accepted. I built a career without needing society's approval. I chose Richard and Rose, even when she threatened to abandon me. "Every time I looked at you," she whispered, "I saw the woman I might have been if I had been braver." It was the closest she had ever come to telling the truth about herself. I told her I could understand how fear had shaped her without accepting what she had done with that fear. Pain could explain cruelty, but it could not excuse it. She asked whether she would ever be allowed to know Rose. I did not give her the forgiveness she wanted. Instead, I gave her conditions. She would begin therapy and remain in it. She would stop lying about the past, stop comparing Sarah and me, and never use money, illness, or guilt to control access to my daughter. Any relationship with Rose would happen slowly, in my presence, and would end the moment Margaret crossed a boundary. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she agreed to everything. I stood to leave and told her that promises were no longer enough. She would have to prove who she was, through actions taken after the audience disappeared. As I reached the door, Margaret called my name. "What if I fail?" she asked. I looked back at the woman who had spent a lifetime demanding perfection from her daughters. "Then you take responsibility," I said, "and you try again without asking us to pay the price." Looking back, I no longer believe my greatest victory was watching the people who mocked me finally face the truth. It was learning that revenge without boundaries can turn pain into another form of cruelty, while forgiveness without accountability only teaches harmful people that they can return without changing. Emily did the right thing by protecting her child, preserving evidence, refusing to argue through rumors, and allowing facts to expose what anger alone never could. When a family repeatedly humiliates, controls, or compares you to others, do not spend your life begging them to recognize your worth. Build financial independence, keep records of serious threats or manipulation, seek trustworthy legal or emotional support, and create firm boundaries before the damage reaches the next generation. At the same time, do not confuse silence with peace. Staying quiet can protect you temporarily, but there comes a moment when truth must be spoken clearly and responsibly. We should also remember that understanding why someone became cruel does not require us to excuse what they did. A painful childhood, fear of rejection, or obsession with appearances may explain harmful behavior, but real reconciliation begins only when the person admits the harm, accepts consequences, and changes consistently over time. Emily did not win because her husband was wealthy. She won because she stopped allowing other people to define her, chose love over approval, and made sure her daughter would never grow up believing she had to earn a mother's affection. That is the lesson worth carrying forward. Protect your peace, tell the truth, forgive carefully, and never sacrifice yourself simply to keep a family image intact.